there, it's Jules here, and I've been trying my hand at making a deck tech of all things, partly because it's easier than the absolute dumb shit I've been trying to script for the past couple months, but also because I feel it's a rare chance for me to feel competent about Yu-Gi-Oh! When Master Duel dropped, I instantly knew what I wanted to build, but upon learning that Fluffals wasn't on there yet, I settled for the first random archetype that kinda caught my fancy. Fluffal wound up being the deck that I picked, and I definitely think I lucked out with my choice. At first, I really wasn't going to bother with trying to make a guide for this deck, because Skyhawk already put out a very extensive guide. I'll link it in the description down below, but I felt like it really covered the deck about as well as anyone could. But as I kept thinking about it, I realized that there was enough about Fluffal specifically for Master Duel that it was worth talking about. In my experience, this deck on the ladder is a fantastic call for the Master Duel format, and that's for really two reasons in particular. First, that it plays very well into the best-of-one format of Master Duel. Fluffal can make some fairly competent boards going first, but also does pretty well going second. Your main playmaker is a hand trap, and there's plenty of space for other hand traps and equalizers too. While you certainly prefer to go first, you go second better than a lot of other decks that are currently grinding on the ladder. And the second thing is the ban list, specifically that Max C is legal in this format. That is fantastic news for Fluffal. It's another fantastic going second option that's still very good if we're on the play. Some people will just skip their entire turn just to deny you of a few cards. But Fluffal also plays very well against Max C. It sets up an extra deck lock when going first, and only special summons twice to do so. Max C is a meta-defining card for Master Duel, and Fluffal's ability to play against and with it is a lifesaver in the tighter matchups you'll come across. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the secret third reason why this deck is so good in Master Duel: literacy. I've had several games where my opponents MST'd my telegraphed scythe or burnt removal on a toy vendor, even in higher ranks. While not a real reason to play the deck, you will certainly have games where your opponent sees red and accidentally scythe locks themselves without even committing to the cruel whale play. It's honestly sad how many games I've stolen at the back of my opponent's own removal. Before breaking things down card by card, I wanted to go over the deck's key game plan. Going first, you're looking at setting up usually one or two of three different things: a Scythe Lock, Totally Awesome, and Appaloosa. Realistically speaking, you're not going to get a ton of games where you get all three at once, although there are hands that can do that. But in a lot of cases, you can usually win a game off of just one and a bit of well maneuvering. The ideal setup is the Scythe Lock. Unless your opponent is rocking a 0-card extra deck, you tend to want to gun for Artifact Scythe going first pretty much whenever possible. And setting up that Scythe Lock is criminally easy in this deck. The key card you're looking for is actually just a different Scythe. In this case, Egypt Scythe, a hand trap that allows you to fusion summon on your opponent's turn using itself as material. So it plus any Fluffal in your hand makes Fright for a Cruel Whale, which can come down and pop one card on both sides of the field. Sadly, when you're going second, it will have to target itself, but Egypt Scythe can actually banish itself to prevent that from happening. But when you're going first, you're able to pop Toy Vendor or, more hopefully, Artifact Scythe. So what you're looking for in an ideal opener is a copy of Egypt Scythe, any random Fluffal, and then some way to summon two monsters to the field to link off into Dagda. If you do that, you get a free Scythe to basically blank your opponent's entire next turn, then hopefully OTK them on yours. And at face value, this might seem a little bit clunky. You have to have 4 cards to both make Dagda, and then have material left in your hand to make the Cruel Whale. But in practice, Fluffal is just full of extension and card draw. This deck can easily end a turn having committed to a full board and still have multiple cards left in its hand. The deck's ability to extend plays very well into the Appaloosa plan, since filling your board up with material is laughably easy once you get the value engine rolling. Toy Vendor is a monstrously fucked up card that can make it format Appo with ease. As for Toad, it just so happens that our best normal summon is level 4 water that can special summon another card from your hand. If you open it plus Dolphin, or find the 2 over the course of the turn, that's a free Toad. This deck has other plays it can make on turn 1, especially with how easily it can make a rank 4. I know some builds are on stuff like Abyss Dweller and other such just good generic rank 4s. Other builds can also go blind second, loading up entirely on just equalizer cards. While I wouldn't fully recommend going blind second in this meta, it's the flexibility of being able to go second if you have to that makes the deck potent. Another thing that makes the deck potent is the ability to stop from overextending. If you can end on Dagda and have Egypt Scythe in hand, you can probably just stop there. Save the rest of your hand for your OTK. One of the best strengths of the Scythe Lock is that it both dodges Nibiru and only draws your opponent 2 cards at most with Max C. You don't need to make a god board with a format Appo, Toad, Scythe Lock, and more. Sometimes it's far better to only commit to one thing and chew through your opponent's other resources, especially if you opened up a hand trap. And the last thing before moving on to the card by card is that I should probably acknowledge the fact that I'm on 43 cards. I could give you the full explanation about how Fluffal's ability to see cards means that you can load up on a bit more things in your deck, because you're going to find a lot of your key pieces regardless, just through how redundant this deck is. But realistically speaking, just the fact that some of you watching this are going to be unreasonably upset at seeing more than 40 cards in this deck is a good enough reason for me to include 43. The first card we're going to talk about is Fluffal Wings. This card is a perfect example of how obscenely good Fluffal is at drawing cards. If you have Wings in your graveyard and control Toy Vendor, you can banish both the Wings and then the Fluffal in the yard to draw a card. Then, you can send that Toy Vendor you control to the graveyard to draw another card. We'll talk about Toy Vendor more in a minute, but sending Toy Vendor is a free search for either any Fluffal or Edge Imp Sabers. So yeah, activating Wings just casually draws you 3 cards. It's not very hard to set this up either. You have multiple ways to either discard the card or foolish it from the deck with something like a Dolphin activation. Resolving Wings feels incredibly unfair literally every time it happens. Octopus is arguably the weakest Fluffal we're running, but still quite useful. If you summon it, you can either bring a Fluffal or Edge Imp from your yard back to the hand, and if you use it for a fusion, it lets you return 2 banished Fluffals to your graveyard. This effect is kind of win more most times it comes up, but it is very funny to resolve Wings for a second time in the game. And of course, here's Max C. We've already talked about it a little bit. It's arguably the most important card in the meta right now, and it's a free roll. If you don't have it, obviously run something else, but Max C is just so good right now that I really couldn't see running anything else besides it. It is, in my opinion, the premier hand trap of the format. Fluffal Sheep is in here mainly as an extender. It's a free special summon as long as you control another Fluffal on the board, and can set up some cute fusion plays, but realistically, it's your 4th material for Appaloosa or Access Code most times you're summoning this thing. Edge Imp Sabers is just more free material, really. We only run it at 1 because it's so easy to get into rotation, and it's pretty weak compared to the other Edge Imps. Much like Sheep, I find this card is mostly useful for its link potential, being able to put a card back on the top of your deck to summon it from the graveyard. While underwhelming compared to the other Edge Imps, it's still going to put in a lot of work whenever it comes up. Fluffal Bear is one of the easiest ways to get a Toy Vendor into rotation. You can discard Bear just to freely set a Toy Vendor from the deck. This card is Wings' best friend, setting up both the Toy Vendor on field and the extra Fluffal in the yard to banish to the Wings effect. You're rarely going to ever summon this guy on purpose unless you're in a really tight spot, but that pitch effect is integral to getting the ball rolling. Next is another easy one, just 3 Ash Blossom. This could realistically be whatever hand trap or going second equalizer you want or already have. I'm on Ash because it feels the most flexible for both going first and going second, and can answer a Max C. You could argue that potentially running the Call by the Grave is better here, and I could definitely see that, but I'm personally on Ash. But this is a pretty flexible slot. Next up is Edge Imp Scythe. I've been considering moving up to 3 copies of it, considering how important it is for our deck, but so far in practice, 2 copies has felt pretty right. This card isn't that hard to find thanks to cards like Patchwork and Chain. Edge Imp Scythe is arguably the second best card in this entire deck, and is a huge part of why this deck is so potent. Getting to fusion summon Cruel Whale or even Tiger on your opponent's turn can be backbreaking, especially if you have the artifact set up. Pretty much any archetype worth its salt has a normal summonable searcher these days, and Fluffal Dog sure is ours. What do you want me to say? It's the searcher. It finds Wings, it finds Bear, it finds whatever you want. Come on, I don't have to explain this card, I don't think. Just reading the effect text should tell you everything you need to know. This card just finds whatever you need it to. Of course, ideally, you'd open up both Dog and Penguin to normal summon Penguin and special the Dog, but Dog sometimes is enough to get it done all by itself. Edge Imp Chain is kind of like the glue that holds this deck together. All you really need to know about Chain is that if you send it to the graveyard from hand or field, you can search up any Frightfur card from your deck and add it to your hand. You have plenty of ways to do this, the best of course being using Chain for a fusion summon or discarding it to Toy Vendor. Each Frightfur spell we run has its own use, and while you're usually only going to grab the Patchwork, sometimes you'll grab one of the 1-ofs to further extend your plays. Penguin just kind of does everything. It's our best normal summon, can bring out another Fluffal from the hand, it's great at making rank 4s, and when you use it as a fusion material, it lets you draw 2 and discard 1, which is particularly great for Fluffal considering how many graveyard effects we have. This card just kind of does everything, and then you always want to open it. Dolphin is Penguin's partner in crime, seeing as how it's the primary way you're going to make Toad in this deck. But Dolphin's actual effects are pretty great too. It can set a Toy Vendor from the graveyard, and if you do, Foolish Burial, a Fluffal, or an Edge Imp. At this point, it should be obvious just how this deck grinds through resources. Everything can add everything else, constantly getting value from Toy Vendor. Wings is painfully easy to get in rotation. Once this ball starts rolling, it's very hard to stop it. and Dolphin's one of the best ways to keep that extension going. Alright, let's talk about it. Artifact Scythe is a bitch card. It's a real fucker. A nasty little piece of shit. You'll feel awful for playing it, but awful in a good way. Some will call it cheap, but don't let them fool you. They were just gonna summon Rongo or something. They're a Yu-Gi-Oh player. It's in their blood. You chose to play Yu-Gi-Oh here, not work at a charity. You're not here to be nice. So set that fucking scythe and watch as your Plat 4 rank up match blindly windmill slams Lightning Storm to pop it and a toy vendor. Artifact Scythe is what Yu-Gi-Oh players deserve. And hey, if they're not playing an extra deck and the card is suddenly dead, that just means they're probably playing Monarchs. You're winning that game anyways. Speaking of things Yu-Gi-Oh players deserve, Eldritch may look a bit weird in here at a glance, but that is until you remember that toy vendor is a thing. Eldritch will get your toy vendor in the yard, he's free material, he helps push for lethal damage, and sometimes even removal. He is truly a quirked up golden boy goated with the sauce. The only real downside here is that we can't run the objectively superior Thirst Trap art from his reprint. I'm only running 2 poly, you could potentially go up to 3, but in my time with the deck, I really never felt a need for it. You have ways to search up your poly, reuse ones you've already used, and generally you only need to use it about once or twice to win a game. You can maybe try a third if you're not happy with how your draws have been, but I really don't think it's needed. Fright for Fusion is about as free as a card can be. If there is any card I've considered going up on more copies of, it's this one. Fusion summoning a Fright for a banishing material from the graveyard is simple and effective. This is a big way to push for a game, and one of the easiest ways to summon up VFD, which we'll talk about in a bit. Foolish Burial Goods does kind of sting with its rarity, but it's the freest way to get Toy Vendor into the yard, and a deck full of pretty easy ways to do that. You could maybe shave 1 for budget concerns, but I really wouldn't recommend it, because not only does this help get your toy vendors going, in a pinch, it can also send Repair for some extra extension. Earlier, I said chain was the glue that held this deck together, and that was a lie. Chain is more like the bottle that holds the glue. The glue is actually Patchwork. Patchwork adds a poly and an edge imp. It's simple, and it does pretty much everything. It can get you Scythe. If you already have Scythe, it can get you Chain. And then just adding the poly is just gravy. It makes it so that you really only need the 2 copies of poly because you're technically running 5. It's a slam dunk of a card. Oh yeah, I kind of forgot to record the part for Fright for Repair in the actual recording of this. It's just because it's a fairly average extender. It's nothing too crazy to write home about. It works in both the hand and the graveyard, but in different ways. And it's pretty easy to turn on. It's only really good at 1. Don't want it at more than that. It's just a fine card. Not really a big deal, but it's a very fine card for the deck for sure. Alright, so we have Toy Vendor. And based on just how much I've talked about this card already without even getting to it yet, you can probably already tell it's a very important card. And it is. It's easily our best card. The most broken thing we can be doing, and it's how our deck really gets above and beyond anything else. But, looking at it at face value, it might not look so obviously powerful. It has 2 effects, one on the field and one when you send it to the graveyard. The on-field effect is simply discard a card and draw a card. Based on what you drew, 2 things will happen. If it was a Fluffal monster, you special summon a monster from your hand. If it wasn't a Fluffal, discard the card you drew. Its sent to the graveyard effect is, when it's sent to the graveyard, add any Fluffal or Edge Imp from your deck to your hand. Both these effects are good, but they're not really game-breakingly good. That is until you realize just how many times you can do this over the course of a turn. Toy Vendor's a soft once per turn, which means the more copies you get into rotation, the more you can do it. And you can reset it from the graveyard back to the field to keep doing it again. It's very easy to get multiple Toy Vendor activations in a single turn, even up to like 4 or more. This card just does everything for you. It makes sure that you're always finding your one-ofs, that you're always finding exactly what you need when you need it, and it's just thinning your deck more and more. There are times where you'll sometimes discard a Toy Vendor to a Toy Vendor, or send the Edge Imp chain, and just get even more value off of an already very valuable card. Toy Vendor is without a doubt why you should be playing Fluffal. This card is what makes this deck even remotely good. Without Toy Vendor, this isn't a deck. Toy Vendor is everything you'll ever need in a card. And then rounding out the main deck is 2 copies of Droplets. I think it's vastly better than Lightning Storm right now because it does have some uses going first, especially since Fluffal can add so many cards to its hand through the course of a combo turn. If you're on a budget, You can sub this out for more cheap interaction. Same with the hand traps, really. It's very good, but not required by any means. So, the extra deck is where Fluffal stops being a Master Duel budget deck. Most of the main deck is rares and commons. I'd say the only really mandatory ultra rare in the main deck is Scythe. Eldritch I'm very high on, but realistically, if you're playing on a budget, you could just use Twin Twister. The extra deck is a bit hard to justify not having some of the higher rarity cards, however. I'll highlight some that can be cut for budget concerns, but there's not that many. If there's any consolation, most of the ultra rares in this deck are pretty generic and usable in other decks you'll be building anyways. Frightfur Tiger is a big dumb idiot that can pop an entire board. I love Tiger, but realistically no, it's usually better just to go with a Cruel Whale and Kraken setup than hinging my entire game plan on one card not getting negated. It's still worth running, but definitely one you can live without, especially for its rarity. Sabertooth does come up a bit more often. It's a decent beater that's hard to remove and can bring back a Frightfur from the yard, but it still doesn't come up a ton. I'd definitely say you still want it in the extra deck for turning on repair at the very least, but I could definitely see living without it in some cases. In an extra deck full of ways to pop cards, Kraken is one card that can pop cards we're almost never going to pop cards with. We're running it because it's fantastic for our OTK plan. It being a double attacker is very good, especially when you boost its power with Cruel Whale. It's very stock standard vanilla beater, but it's really all you need to close out games sometimes, especially with Cruel Whale on the board. And speaking of Cruel Whale, it is our most integral card in the extra deck. When summoned, it lets you pop a card on both sides of the field, and then can bin a Frightfur from your main or extra deck to give any Frightfur an attack boost. If you summon 2 of these things, well, that's 2 level 9 monsters. And there's a reason why that's very good for us, and we'll get there. Trust me, we'll get there. Very, very soon. Toad and Bahamut Shark are a pair. I really can't mention one without the other, mainly because Bahamut Shark only exists to summon Toad. It's a humble existence, but boy does he do it well. Toad is an Omni-Negate that can recycle itself if your shark stays on the board, or a penguin or a dolphin. It's a very good piece of interaction. It can sometimes stop a Nibiru coming down if you're going for a big combo turn. These cards are fantastic. There's a reason that Toad's limited to 1. I don't agree with it, but I do understand it. This package is 2 more ultra rares, but you really do want both of them for this. Dugaris is here mainly for pushing for damage on the OTK turn. Mainly you're going to be trying to double Kraken's attack after a Cruel activation just to push for a ton of lethal damage. Although I have had some games where I've actually used Dugaris' draw effect to extend when I had a rough opener where some of my plays negated. Even if I don't win that turn, this deck draws cards so easily on its own that I'm not really missing my draw for turn half the time. Dugaris has let me just steal games I really shouldn't have. It's a fantastic little insurance policy for the deck. So, VFD. Do I really need to say anything? I suppose that's not fair. Some of you might not even know why I'm calling this card VFD. Clearly the card's name is True King of All Calamities, but I'm calling it VFD. Why is that? That's because he's a very fun dragon. He's a fun guy, and he's here to have a fun time. He had so much fun in the TCG they banned him, but he's legal here. Our deck can make this very fun dragon. With 2 copies of Cruel Whale, you can just overlay them together and suddenly, boom, you have a very fun dragon. Then you can even detach some material, and VFD will say a word, and we'll play a game with the opponent. And that opponent will sit there so stunned and so happy to be playing this game that they won't even play a card. They'll just pass it right back, saying, you can go again, VFD. Have fun. And VFD will, and the game will be over. It's a simple card, you know. I don't get why people are upset about it. They could just play cards, but they don't. They just see VFD like, okay, cool. I'll let that happen, and I'll just not play my turn. I don't get it, but you know, that's their choice to make. It's a very fun dragon. I get why they wouldn't want to hurt its feelings. So, you know, that's really all there is to say about VFD. Although I will say, if you are looking for ultra rares to cut, you can trim this one and save the fun for later if you need to. Back to cards that actually do things. Cross Sheep is just some more extension that can also feed an access code talker. It's not really integral to any of your set combo plays, but it's good enough that you're going to tend to want it in here. Just having a good link monster for more material for access code for pops is just very good in general, and its effects can sometimes extend a combo board out a bit further than it could otherwise. Dagda has a lot of text on it, but really all you have to concern yourself with is that 2 monsters makes Dagda, Dagda grabs Scythe and sets Scythe. What happens after that, it's all up to the other Scythe that's hopefully in your hand. That's really all Dagda's here for, although it does also feed Access Code Talker as well. And then Unicorn also helps feed Access Code Talker. I wanted a decent 3 in this deck just to make Access Code a bit beefier for those OTK turns, and Unicorn felt like the best one. It's a good way to remove a problematic card or some unknown back row. It's definitely not needed for the deck, especially if it's an ultra rare. I happen to pull mine in a master pack, but if you have one, I'd definitely say it's worth throwing it in. But there are other options you could run for sure. Appaloosa is really a big part of why going first is a good option for us. Without her, we'd really be set with just like Toad Pass, maybe like make another rank 4. Generally not really where we wanted to be with the deck. Without Appaloosa, you're dedicated to going Blinding Second, which is not the best on the Master Duel ladder right now. I will say that Appaloosa is very easy for us to use. We just barf out material like nobody's business. She really helps tie together the deck very well. She is absolutely mandatory for this build of the deck. You cannot do this deck without her. Access Code's here because it's a fantastic way to close out games without having full access to your fusion lines. Sometimes Kraken's not going to cut it for game, and Access Code can help clear out a lot of the pesky things in the way. You really do want this, although if you went a bit more all in on the fusions, you could probably get away without running it, or have something like a Boral Sword in there. And then finally, we have a copy of Underworld Goddess in here. It's mainly a concession to cards like Geomathematic Final Sigma or Crooked Cook. She can be cut, but she saved my ass more than enough time to justify having a slot in here. And that's the whole list. There's room for tweaks and cuts, of course, but I feel like this build is a pretty good spot. It wasn't very hard at all to ride this deck to Platinum. Part of what makes it so interesting to play is seeing just how far you can stretch your resources. This deck has some set plays you're trying to pull off, but the way you get there can change a lot game to game. It's kind of like a puzzle figuring out how you can make the best board possible with the random Fluffals and edge imps you have in your hand. It's rare that I'm making the exact same play from game to game. It's also rare that I feel like I've actually bricked and come up with a stone cold unplayable hand. This deck has just so many options to extend and push through interaction and kind of bricky draws. This was a pretty simple overview of the deck. If you want something a bit more in-depth, which also shows you some test games and test hands, I cannot recommend Skyhawk's video on the deck enough. And hey, since I finally produced a proper YouTube video, I can finally say that time-honored mantra of, if you enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe. Who knows, I might even try to make more of something like this if this channel actually gets any interest on it. Until then, I hope that you have a lovely day and that your opponent draws the driver.